Hello, Mary Ward students. This is Dan, and today's lecture, which will become an online class, is week 10 of our course on Martha Nussbaum. And this week we are looking at anger. I hope you're all doing well at the moment. I hope all your loved ones are doing well, and I hope you're adjusting more to this period of self-isolation. And maybe this kind of discussion over the next hour or so of anger in a historical and philosophical vein will be a nice and interesting distraction. Maybe something different to think about. Okay. Hi. Just so you know, as a real person here as well, I look forward to us going back to normal at some point soon. Soon, I hope. Right, onto the class. Okay. Right, so I want us first to think back on the various weeks of our course and think about why anger would matter to Martha Nussbaum. When we think about the direction of the text that we have been reading and debating, we have seen often, especially early on in her career, an interest in the world of ancient Greece and in ancient Rome, in tragedy, in Stoicism. The running argument, and a very interesting, very compelling argument, that the emotions are not animal instincts, but that the emotions are cognitive, and that they involve kind of dispositions and ideas about things that we value. Also, that we cannot become gems, we cannot become entirely self-sufficient, we cannot become godlike, as Nussbaum charges against the Stoic tradition. There's something about being human which is about being interdependent and being reliant on others. That's just a fact of our lives from our very birth to our deaths. We are surrounded by other people and we are reliant on them. This neediness, this messiness, this vulnerability, this fragility isn't necessarily a weakness. As we saw last week with the Rousseau quote, it's a strength. It gives us a capacity to love. It gives us a capacity to care. It brings into our life all the goods that we hold dearest. So let's think then about anger and what place anger has. Well, one thing that came up last week in a discussion of shame and disgust was that anger in itself is a kind of reasonable emotion. As a broad type of emotion, it could be reasonable because it's ultimately concerned with things that we value, goods that matter to us. So anger, in that sense, isn't necessarily something that we are going to entirely overstep or leave behind. The question, at least in hiding from humanity, is what role should a negative emotion play in the role of justice, in lawmaking? Now here, in anger and forgiveness, the concern is slightly broader. It's about the role of anger for the good life, for human flourishing. Now, Nussbaum says in The Monarchy of Fear, which is a book that we're going to look at next week, that anger ultimately relates to fear at our own human vulnerability. What's interesting in this book from 2018, so it's a couple of years after the one that we're going to talk about, is that she kind of recaps and discusses a lot of the theory of anger, but then she kind of tweaks it and expands it in different ways. And this is something that we might talk about next week as well. So there's something about anger which is about our need, our reliance on external goods. Now, we cannot live without these external goods. There's something too about an elementary fear of our own vulnerability and weakness, something that we are born into, something that we experience throughout our lives. So that's all present. But you might have noticed, say compared to last week, that there isn't so much of an interest, at least in the sections here, on child psychology. That this book from Nussbaum is a kind of return back to themes in philosophy and classical literature. So what themes in particular? Well, what you see before you is Achilles in the Iliad. Now, the first word of the Iliad by Homer, we think, is anger. The anger of Achilles that brought, quote, thousand-fold pains upon the Achaeans. Anger is very present in this book. Anger then, in a sense, is very present in the ancient world, or at least in the world of classical Greece. But it's interesting when we kind of think and dig into the role of anger in ancient Greece, and this is something that we're also going to talk about, that anger was inherently irrational, and that anger and the furies were often feminized. Even the way that ira, the Latin word for anger, is itself a feminine word. And there's a relationship between anger and gender that we will also talk about in this class as well. So we have this point about vulnerability. We have this sense quite quickly that anger involves some undoing of the self. But there could be more to it as well. Because is anger necessarily a bad thing? Now, you might have thought early on, or at least during the reading, that maybe not. Maybe we need to be careful about how quickly we dismiss the value of anger. Because anger, after all, is vital to justice campaigns, to protest campaigns and protest movements. You can see this on the left in the civil rights era, although Nussbaum is going to make an interesting point about how, in this case, the protesters were left behind or transitioned from a kind of anger. And on the right, this is an image from the Occupy St. Paul's from a few years ago. Anger is also an energy. Anger, we might say moral anger or indignation at a wrong caused by someone we care about or a principle that we value or cause. This anger leads us to fight back in important ways. So the theorist Sarah Ahmed in Cultural Politics of Emotions makes it like an interesting and quite persuasive case for the value of anger. She says that anger already involves a reading of the world in a particular way. Further, identifying as a feminist is dependent upon taking that anger as the grounds for a critique of the world. So anger, maybe Nussbaum wouldn't disagree with this, that anger, like any emotion, involves something cognitive, it involves dispositions, it involves evaluations. But Ahmed's point is that part of taking a critical stance, a critical perspective on the world is to take up a position of anger, and maybe that's an anger that you're not necessarily going to want to let go of. So Audre Lorde makes a similar point, in this case about racism. She says, "My response to racism is anger. Anger is expressed and translated into action in the service of our vision and our future. And this is a liberating and strengthening act of clarification. Anger is loaded with information and energy." Well, we could kind of think about this in more recent protest movements. The climate struggles, Extinction Rebellion, Greta Thunberg. A sense of righteous anger, of indignation at the way that the world, governments, and Extinction Rebellion are kind of often targeting governments, nation states, are not doing enough to deal with the looming climate crisis. We might see this with Black Lives Matter. Now, in these justice campaigns and these protest campaigns, it isn't just enough to be on the right side. Anger is what gathers people together, and it's this kind of emotional glue in which people can kind of express their frustrations, express their positions, and find strength and common cause with others. If they're not angry, then would they still have the same drive to do that? This is the thing. So we're starting to see here two different kinds of angers. Now, a question for you. Over the last few days, has there been anything that has made you angry? Has there been anything that you found frustrating? And if so, why? And how did you react? Did you listen to people on TV or the radio? And were you annoyed at the things that they said? Have you found yourself losing your temper with loved ones? I guess at this time of lockdown during coronavirus, we're probably all experiencing in different ways forms of cabin fever, because we're pressed up close to people who we may love, but we don't spend every day of every week with. So what does that anger mean? And what do we do with that anger? Again, you'll probably have noticed that I might be conflating two different forms of anger. We've got the anger about issues, the anger about politicians, the anger about rioting, the anger against injustice. And then I'm kind of conflating this with more personal forms of anger. Anger when things don't go our way. Anger when someone that we care about is taken away from us. Anger when someone just doesn't bloody work. Ugh. Maybe we need two different words. Perhaps we should keep this in mind too. Now, when I gave you that question earlier, you might have been thinking about this man. I don't know. Maybe you might not have been. Maybe this is a particular moment where anger isn't so relevant as other times. Now, when we think about Donald Trump and the kinds of lies that he often says, this is something that maddens us. It fills us with rage because it's wrong. It's wrong, but it's persuasive for so many, and it seems to have such a harmful direction on global politics. Okay. But then there's a thing here too about what does that anger mean? Is just an anger as a form of indignation? And should we be talking about anger and indignation as two separate things? What do we do with this political kind of anger? So, sometimes it's said that we live in an age of anger, or we did pre-coronavirus. That things like Brexit, Trump, the election of right-wing demagogues in many parts of the world all pointed to something new. Something that Pankaj Mishra, in a great book, The Age of Anger, calls the Age of Anger. Now, what does Mishra mean by this? Well, Mishra's making quite an interesting point, and he looks back to the late 19th century about how the promises of liberal rationalism, the promises of modernity, a kind of a good life for all under clear, slightly technocratic government. These have been promises that haven't been fulfilled for many people that have found themselves in more economically and socially precarious and insecure positions. A bit like the 19th century. And for some of you Hannah Arendt nerds, you might remember that Hannah Arendt also discussed something quite similar in the rise of what she called the mob in the late 19th century. These are people that had been involved in some way, or their parents had, in skilled trades, but because of an economic downturn in the late 19th century, because of automation back then, people had been kind of cast into more insecure, lesser paid work. They had become rootless. They were often those who tried their luck migrating to various European colonies overseas. They seemed to have no affiliation, and they were the first, in Hannah Arendt's argument, to join up with the fascist parties. Now, Mishra doesn't really focus on Arendt. He's got other literary examples, but the point here is that anger itself could be a kind of symptom. That if we live in an age that is more angry, people will be more angry with each other on social media, then that points to maybe a sense of vulnerability or frustration in people's social positions that then plays out in our personal emotions. Maybe I'm wrong to kind of suggest that indignation, political anger, and personal anger are not linked. Maybe they're very linked. So let's keep this question in mind. Okay, so we're having this kind of debate already. And then you might be thinking this is making this too lofty. What I want us to now start thinking about is anger as something that's shameful. Because when I got you to think about moments where you've lost your temper, you might have felt embarrassed. You might have felt shame, which we talked about last week. Shame that it was wrong to say a harsh word to a loved one because they didn't do something that you wanted them to do. Or to have got cross about something in a shop when ultimately it's just a machine. Vending machine rage. This is something that Martha Nussbaum discusses. And the 3 young men who lost their lives in the year 1988 in the United States when they were crushed by vending machines that they were hitting or shaking because the vending machine had made their product get stuck. Of course, you probably have got angry at these bloody machines in supermarkets all around the UK now. Yeah. Unexpected item in packing area. Please wait for store assistance. It's so annoying, but yet why are we losing our temper with a machine? And yet we do. So there's something about anger where we suddenly lose it, where we might feel embarrassed later. We might feel that something about the projections of ourselves being rational and calm and good and altruistic and whatever, are dissolved. They're undermined by losing it and seeing red and so on. Anger, we're also seeing, is nothing new. An early 16th century image, a Renaissance image of people at each other's throats, literally here. Again, you might notice that the two figures at the top are women. And there's something that we will need to talk about more about anger and gender. But the guy just underneath is pulling his hair out. We can see that the food is thrown everywhere. Now, this is just called anger. So this is really a study of the facial expressions, the bodily movements, but also the sin of anger in the Christian tradition. Because among the 7 deadly sins is anger, ira. You can see this here. This is Hieronymus Bosch. The 7 deadly sins. There's ira at the bottom. You might, if you look at it, you'll notice it's kind of in the shape of a circle, and you could kind of tilt this around and see the various sins. Well, what's happening in this image? Well, it's kind of like a barroom brawl, although outside. We can see one man has had a table thrown at his head. These 2 men have obviously been drinking, and we can see that they're clutching onto wine jugs. One is about to attack another with a sword. We can see the kind of clothing scattered about the place. So anger here is about dissolution, about drunkenness, about irrationality. And we see the female figure this time holding one of the men back. So Bosch is immediately subscribing to this idea that we're going to see more and more of, that anger is part of one gender or another. Well, in this case, it's the men that are losing their temper because they've got drunk and had some sort of disagreement. In all these cases, anger is a problem. Here's another image of anger. Don't worry, there's not going to be 2 more of this. I just find it interesting to put it in historical context. I think this is on the side of a monastery, some sort of holy building in Vézelay in France. It's anger, flame-haired. But what's anger doing, this kind of female animal figure? Well, we know from the title, anger commits suicide, and you might see that anger is kind of pushing a sword into her own body. So this is an image on a religious building, and the point here is that anger is something that will undo us. That we become so angry we will harm ourselves and destroy ourselves. So anger isn't just about something that could be shameful or something regrettable. If we frequently lose our temper in this kind of Christian tradition, it may kill us. It fills us up with these horrible violent urges which can only ultimately be released, well, if we don't harm someone else, on harming ourselves. So anger is a big problem, as we are seeing. Now let's think about this book. What's Martha Nussbaum trying to do? So Anger and Forgiveness comes out in 2016. But it's based on a series of lectures that Nussbaum gave, the Locke lectures at Oxford University in 2014, where she presented basically large parts of the argument of this book, and there were seminars where it was discussed. So we've kind of noticed this with Nussbaum, especially in her later career, that she positions herself as a liberal philosopher who gives a treatment to various different subjects. We've looked at some of those treatments, like shame and disgust, like how the capabilities approach itself, but how it affects certain things like women. We've looked at aging on a previous course. She writes about patriotism and animal rights elsewhere. So here is Anger and Forgiveness. But what I think makes this book rewarding is that it isn't such a doesn't feel like such a tick box way of addressing a subject that authors are written on and therefore one should give a position on. This is an interesting one because it's dealing with the role of a negative emotion and working out how it can be useful for philosophy. Now, Nussbaum sets out to be quite balanced, and she sets out at first, and that's something that you may want to think about. How balanced does she remain? And one of the things that I'm going to ask you to think about and discuss is the way that she will come to read anger as something broadly negative, but with a potentially very positive component. Anyway, Nussbaum early on in chapter 2, which is what we're going to focus on, kind of starts off by giving us a brief traditional overview. And she focuses on the words of Bishop Joseph Butler. Now, Butler is kind of very much shaped by this Christian, ancient Greek, Stoic tradition of distrusting anger. And Butler says, no other principle or passion hath for its end the misery of our fellow creatures. It aims to cause misery for others. It's interesting how Nussbaum is going to come back to this and relate it to Aristotle a lot, and we're going to talk about Aristotle as well in a moment, about the importance of retribution. So we see in many different traditions that there is a condemnation of anger. The ones that I mentioned, Nussbaum also draws on Buddhism and Hinduism, but we're probably going to see this in virtually all major world religions and kind of philosophical schools. Now, Nussbaum notes early on that, at least in terms of philosophy, we haven't really properly understood anger. We just tend to classify it as something a bit negative and a bit bad. She quotes the philosopher Peter Strawson that anger is among reactive attitudes and feelings. But what does that mean, that anger is just reactive or it's negative? This for Nussbaum is too abstract. I think sometimes she doesn't always give credit for the depth of some of the positions that she skirts over, but at least as she sees it philosophically, we've just seen anger as something a bit kind of generically negative. Or we might kind of recycle Stoic ideas that anger is bad. But what Nussbaum's trying to say is, what is anger philosophically? What universally is anger? And this is what her account's about. And she is going to say, here we go, slightly behind. She's going to say that anger is about a desire for payback, about retribution. And this is a key part of our argument. It's nearly always, but not always, going to involve this. But this anger is going to be harmful to our flourishing unless we can get beyond the fixation on revenge, on payback, and we can use it, use the injury or use the harm to kind of focus on some future source of welfare and change. Now, let me give you a quote where she kind of sets out this in a bit more detail about what anger can do and what anger often does. So she says that we've got two possibilities of anger when we think about it. And I quote, either anger focuses on some significant injury, such as a murder or rape, or it focuses only on the significance of the wrongful act for the victim's relative status, as what Aristotle calls a down ranking. In the first case, the idea of payback makes no sense, since inflicting pain on the offender does not remove or constructively address the victim's injury. I think this is a brilliant point. I continue. In the second, it makes all too much sense. Payback may successfully effect a reversal of positions, but only because the values involved are distorted. Relative status should not be so important. Nussbaum's going to call this first position later magical thinking. That we can somehow remove the injury, we can somehow make it better by injuring someone else. Nussbaum says, no, come on, that's not going to work. In this second case, this might be more relevant for kind of rioting or protest campaigns. Yes, we may get payback on the authorities. This might put us in a more powerful position. But at the same time, this is just about, as Nussbaum will argue, about our own status. We're too fixated on our own narcissistic status, on our own position, and not on creating universal conditions of kind of greater welfare and cooperation and so on. So Nussbaum is going to make this point about anger, which is kind of personal, but it's also political. That anger is very human. It is central to political justice campaigns, but they can't just be about anger. They will get eaten up by anger. They will seek new things to blame. They will burn out in these kind of negative emotions unless these movements can find a way to transition, to go from something negative and reactionary to something that's constructive. That's about building towards a future good, which sounds great. It sounds great, but is it going to be enough? That is what we're going to think about. Okay, let's just go back briefly to Achilles, because I didn't really mention, why is he so angry? What is bothering him? Now, it's useful to think about Achilles, because this is going to be a good way to think about why Aristotle is going to talk about the role of anger and the way that he defines it. So in the Iliad, which begins with anger, Achilles is angry. because he feels he has been wronged. Agamemnon, a general in charge of the Achaeans, he has ignored the priest of Apollo, who's given him a certain warning about what he should do, and Agamemnon just ignored him. And then as a result, Apollo has sent a plague to the Achaeans, and this has killed lots of people. And there's been a dispute between Achilles and Agamemnon. And in the end, Agamemnon takes away Achilles' battle prize. Well, battle prize sounds like an object, but this is a woman, Briseis, a woman who he loves, who I think was the queen of one of these cities that they have kind of looted and attacked. So Agamemnon takes away his battle prize, takes away this thing that he really values and loves, and he is filled with rage. He is angry and he is going to get revenge. So Nussbaum is going to present this when she talks about anger for Aristotle. Well, she's going to present her own account that anger needs to be seen as something eudaimonistically, but at least in ancient Greece, which is concerned about flourishing, anger also has this fixation on status. And what Nussbaum wants us to do, she's going to present this account about status, which is deep. She's going to say it's a feature of a society like ancient Greece, but we can also see it in other societies as well. But what Nussbaum wants us to do when we think about Achilles and his rage is kind of get beyond that and look at all species of anger. And not only that, we know that there's this component to Nussbaum's work which is often understated, especially in a work that discusses capabilities, because this is about establishing a minimum threshold for people to universally live a human life. And Nussbaum is always clear that she's not going to dictate, apart from these 10 conditions, she's not going to dictate what a society should and shouldn't do. It's up for that society to deliberate and decide. But we noticed in the work last week, Shane discussed that when it comes to law and legal institutions in the United States, there needs to be something which is about embodying and instructing norms for a liberal society. And I think this element, this normative element, comes out in places here. Nussbaum says that we should consider anger as something eudaimonistically. Right, Nussbaum scholars, what does that mean? And where does that come from? You're probably, hopefully, some of you might be getting this. Compassion in upheavals of thought. There was a concern about eudaimonistic judgments. Now, when Nussbaum thinks about something eudaimonistically, it's based on Aristotle and the idea eudaimonia of flourishing. So we need to think about what anger means in terms of our flourishing and also the flourishing of people that we care about. So Nussbaum says that anger, because it's like any emotion, it's got this cognitive element, it involves evaluations or appraisals. Anger tells us something, like in the words of the Lord, anger has information. Nussbaum says anger tells us something from the point of view of the agent. And when we look at an agent's anger, she says that it enables us to register their own view of what matters for life. So it's when something within someone's circle of concern is harmed in some way. So think back to the things that made you angry in the last week, or just in general, seeing red. Is Nussbaum's definition capturing that for you? I think there's something about the account here which is quite cognitive, which is, it's really rooted in flourishing and values, and we might think that maybe something's missing. Maybe a lot of anger is really reactive. Nussbaum says kind of quite early on in chapter 2 that, well, when we are angry, we go red, our breath shortens, we grind our teeth and we get ready for battle, fight or flight. But she makes this really kind of quick and curious dismissal. She says, well, these bodily states are inconstant, they're not universal, so let's not think about them too much. Now, if you were going to write an essay on anger, would you be so quick to dismiss these physical sides? Bodily anger? I don't know. Let's keep digging. Okay, so let's look at how Aristotle defines anger, because this is important for Nussbaum. And Nussbaum focuses on a definition that Aristotle gives in his work Rhetoric. But rhetoric is a work aimed at orators, at people who make speeches or who are learning the art of speech making. And it's about, he's kind of saying about how to kind of summon up anger in your audience. So maybe it's slightly different from anger in an ethical or political way. So Nussbaum has this definition early on. I've often seen this definition in other discussions of anger. Let's just have a look at it. Now, anger is a desire accompanied by pain for an imagined retribution on account of an imagined slighting inflicted by people who have no legitimate reason to slight oneself or one's own. So we'll notice here that slighting or downranking, as Nussbaum has already said, is a key part of the definition of anger. Kind of harming of status, like Achilles, harming of reputation. Now, we might also notice that there's this imagined part about wanting and desiring or thinking about revenge for this slighting. So when Nussbaum is looking at this definition, she breaks it down into 5 parts. There's 5 elements. And there's 2 ways that we can look at this. We'll look at the way that Nussbaum does it, and then I'm going to give you a summary of what Nussbaum's saying, which comes from another author, Thomas Dixon, who writes a great review of this work, and I'm going to put this review up on Moodle as well. Let's look at Nussbaum on Aristotle first, the 5 elements. So the first is being downranked, being slighted, but then it involves of ourselves or people that are close to us. Nussbaum is going to challenge this bit a bit later. Now, I don't know if this bit is so clear in Aristotle's definition, but for Nussbaum, it's an important third part, which is that this slighting is not justified. Actually, to be fair, it is there. I'm not saying this correctly. About how Aristotle says that we cannot have there isn't a legitimate reason for this slighting. And Nussbaum says, well, if the slighting is wrongfully or inappropriately done. Now, we might, I don't know, let's say we are with friends that have children or a child, and the child is frustrated at the parent and calls the parent a rude word. Now, if us and the parents laugh because it's kind of absurd, then this slighting doesn't give us a sense of pain. So we're not going to be angry about it. We might chuckle. What's important for anger is that we need to be pained at the way that ourselves or someone close to us has been slighted, but also we then want revenge. This is the key thing. This is something that Nussbaum is going to circle back to. The need for revenge. Is that always there? Anyway, Thomas Dixon, he says, right, we can get those 5 elements and we can make it more crisply clear. See what you think. Maybe this makes it even more clearer. So, what are we dealing with? Actually, 3 things. The first is the belief that I or someone in my circle of concern have been injured or wronged. Okay, that's kind of there. But then the painful feeling that accompanies this belief, and then the desire for payback. Okay, maybe Nussbaum's done enough. Maybe we don't need a second definition. All right. Now, in front of you, this is a Dutch country scene. Now we can see some farm workers, some peasants are attacking each other. What's going on? Well, the author probably means this in a kind of slightly comic way of, look at these yokels, kind of crude and primitive yokels, getting their swords out with little provocation. But when we see this image, we can also extrapolate that something has happened. That these people are coming out of a pub and they're chasing away a couple of people. You can see a woman that's holding a baby. Looks like, I don't know if that spear is going to go up the baby's backside. I hope not. You might notice that the people that are being chased away are wearing more luxurious clothes. Maybe there's a kind of a wealth thing here, a social class, we don't know. But some kind of disagreement has occurred. These people in the pub have been offended. They have been wronged in some way. They feel they have been wronged, and now they are getting revenge. Now they are chasing these out with violence. So some kind of harm, some kind of perceived disagreement has resulted in violent physical conflict. So what does that mean for our account? Well, Nussbaum is going to talk about this in terms of a double movement. The double movement is how we fixate on something that is in the past injury. We don't fixate, we are kind of harmed or we are shaped with that past injury in the way that we perceive it, causes us from looking in the past to look forwards, look into the future, and to focus on harming something in particular, the person who has wronged us. The vending machine that hasn't given out our can of Diet Coke. We're going to get revenge. So backwards and forwards, past the future. Now Aristotle says that this double movement can involve pleasure. We can enjoy getting revenge. Now that's true, isn't it? That's not something that Nussbaum is really gonna. She acknowledges this, but she doesn't really seem to believe this. But maybe we might be able to see this when we've lost it, when we have smashed something. In that moment, we might have felt a short and very intensely pleasurable hit of satisfaction. Good, it deserved it. But then later we might feel a sense of shame and embarrassment. Why did we smash that vending machine? Now the alarm is ringing. Now everyone is looking at us like we're crazy. So we can feel a sense of pleasure, but it's not necessarily a good pleasure. It's not one that's going to relate to our flourishing. But we can see too, when we think about this pub scene, but we see that anger involves a sense of cause and effect. That something has caused these people to lash out. Something has harmed them. They have had some sort of loss, some sort of pain, and so on. So there is a kind of information, but it's all different. And Nussbaum is going to make this comparison with grief. Grief is also a negative emotion. Could often also be about loss, but it's not about, there's no target as such. We lose someone that we really care about, but we don't, often when we're thinking here about death, what can we blame? What can we get payback on? What are other things that we grieve? Things that were in our lives that are not. Sometimes it's just not, it's not clear how we might find a cause. But also, I think it's one of the stages of grief that we are angry, that we look for a cause. This made this happen. That's not fair. It's not fair that this happens. We might come back to grief a bit more towards the end. Now, when Nussbaum is giving these examples of the country pub, or when we think about Achilles, she's got in mind, well, she doesn't give the example of the country pub, I do. She's got in mind here this first thing about status. And notice that in this chapter she talks about status and payback, and she's going to move to a second kind of anger later, and that anger we're going to come back to. So there are these common conceptions. This is vital for Aristotle's account that anger is about being slighted. Allegoria. But Nussbaum says, is it always about being slighted? Maybe there are other times where we're not slighted. So she mentions, well, she does it very broadly, the account of justice campaigns, of principles. Like when maybe we might feel a sense of anger, moral anger, indignation, when we read about Donald Trump coming up with something really harmful and stupid that is going to harm people in Latin America, or it's going to harm poorer people in America, or we might be angered because of some injustice somewhere else. These might not be people that we know. Of course they're not. Well, they might be, but they're probably not going to be. Now you might say, well, they're still in our circle of concern, but now we're talking about a very broad circle of concern. If we're concerned about the rights of human beings across the world, if we're angered about human rights violations, then it isn't always just about our own status then. And it isn't always just about ourselves. And in fact, Nussbaum's point is that we need to kind of get beyond this fixation on ourselves. Maybe there's something about the meditation on what she calls status injury, which is going to reinforce the idea that anger is justified when status is harmed. Nussbaum's going to make another really important point. This is something new that is going to come up, and I'm going to explore this more towards the end of this lecture, which is about why we get angry, and about how some aspect of it involves some basic vulnerability or insecurity, about things that we cannot fundamentally control, about anger giving us an illusory sense of regaining control of something that we have lost control or we did not have control over. On page 21 of Anger and Forgiveness, she says, we are prone to anger to the extent that we feel insecure or lacking control with respect to the aspect of our goals that has been assailed, and to the extent that we expect or desire control. Anger aims at restoring lost control and often achieves at least an illusion of it. So this is interesting. If you think about this age of anger or right-wing populism, people being more angry now, does this itself reflect a more broader kind of crisis of status or economic and social insecurity of the last few years? Is that why we're getting more angry? Because more and more of us are vulnerable, are precarious. There are moments in this chapter, in this book, where Nussbaum seems to take a side in such a way that I think she can be a little bit too quick at dismissing other positions. When I say this, you might immediately think of a couple of examples. I'm going to give you another example a bit later. This is the anger of the shop clerk. I should have showed you this earlier because it's great. Although, in the example that Nussbaum gives, it's off the shop clerk on the phone while we're waiting to be served, and us not knowing, us being kind of angry and upset that we're being ignored until we discover that the shop clerk is on a phone call about the life and death of her child. Okay, there's a thing there about anger, about what justifiability, justifications for anger. Let me get back to this point I want to make. So when Nussbaum focuses via Aristotle on this idea of payback, that this is at the root of anger, but then we need to get beyond it. In some cases it's not there, but in most it is. Now Nussbaum there's a couple of bits where I'm just not sure. It is impressive. It's pretty impressive that so many first-rate thinkers should agree on this definition that anger is about retribution. But I'm not sure. I'm just going to plant a seed of doubt. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm just going to plant a seed of doubt here about this kind of payback thing, about some of the rapid points that are being made. I don't think that this appeal to authority is always a good one. We could say the same about many other things. Many other great philosophers have thought other things. They have believed that the soul is immortal. They have believed that we have absolute free will, that the mind and body are two distinct substances. Okay, great. Plato, Descartes, Kant, and so on. Doesn't mean that it always works. Let me come back to the seed of doubt a bit later. Now, we're going to look at some examples of anger and payback, and we're going to use this to get into this idea of magical thinking. First, I'm going to give you an example from the Renaissance, which is not in Nussbaum, and then we're going to look at a couple of examples that Nussbaum gives of the two friends, Angela and Rebecca, and offender O. And then we're going to look at tax justice campaigns, and we're going to use this material to then think about what transition means, which is important to Nussbaum. So, just firstly, a painting from Titian, The Healing of the Wrathful Sun. Now, we can see there is a young man who looks like he's kind of dead. Well, he's been brought back to life. He has cut off his own foot, but his foot has been kind of sort of magically, through divine help, reattached. Now, the wrathful son got angry at his mum and kicked her. And he was so angry and so ashamed that he cut off his own foot and he nearly died. And then he's healed here, and this is what healing's about. Point for Titian. The point for a Renaissance Christian tradition, and the point I think that Nussbaum is going to try and make, without reference to Titian, is that anger and its expression of rage, this desire for revenge, is always going to ultimately end up as being something harmful. It is something that we need to get away from. She's quite distrustful of anger, but there is a lot of very good reasons given. Let's look at the way that she presents what anger should do and what anger shouldn't do. So we're going to look at the example of Angela and Rebecca and offender O. So Nussbaum, in this case, it's on a university campus, and Rebecca is raped by offender O. Nussbaum says she's not really going to make it clear here how well she knows offender O. But the point here is about how her friend Angela should react. What can she do for her friend who has been deeply wronged? And she gives a variety of scenarios. And they're quite heavily weighted towards this concept of transition that she's going to outline later. So what should Angela do with Rebecca? So option one is she spends time with Rebecca and she supports her with therapy, with rehabilitation. She grieves with her, she cares for her. But the thing that she focuses on in kind of outcome one is not revenge at all. It's not about offender O. It's about helping her friend. It's about focusing on her friend's loss, helping her friend rebuild. Now in outcome two, the scope widens. So it's the same as before, but this time around, Angela isn't just upset at her friend being harmed. She sees that this is something that happens to many other women. So she sets up a rape survivor support group and she campaigns. Here, it's not about the pain and loss of her friend, but it's about of all women that are raped. It's about sexual violence more broadly. In both cases, we've got to focus not on retribution, but trying to get beyond retribution, trying to transition quite quickly to doing something constructive that is future focused. And in one case for her friend and another for other women. Now in the third case, which we might consider to be the most common and more immediate, is she wants to make offender O suffer. She wants to cause him pain. Nussbaum doesn't explain how, but we might imagine like a very long jail sentence, or she might desire that he is physically her, that a lynch mob gets him. Now Nussbaum's point is that, well, in 3, it doesn't make anything better, does it? Because this is part of the presentation of the argument, that she's already set out these scenarios where real kind of useful, constructive goods emerge out of the anger. The problem in 3 is that Angela would succumb to what Nussbaum calls magical thinking. It's not good. Inflicting pain isn't going to make anything better. And if anything, it's going to be counterproductive. The anger is going to eat us up, and it's going to cause more harm for others, and that may in turn harm us, or they might harm someone else. It's not going to do anything. She gives the example of the basketballer Michael Jordan, where reacting after his dad was murdered, he's asked, should the murderer get the death sentence? And Jordan says, it's not going to make a difference. Why? That wouldn't bring him back. Now, these are powerful and brilliant sentiments. We're going to come back to them again in a moment. Now, how is it that Michael Jordan or Angela can react with a sense of future focus? What I think is that in both cases, there needs to be this kind of deep internal and external sense of security. A sense of knowing what is deeply right, of knowing what could be a good or what shouldn't be pursued because it will be harmful. Now that's not often possible for all of us. Sometimes in the words of the words of Medea in Ovid, the Roman poet Ovid, we see the better and yet we pursue the worse. We know what is right. We know what the calm and cool and rational person does, but we are still filled with rage and we still want to harm and hurt. It's not always straightforward. So this is something that I want us to think about too, with that slight seed of doubt just earlier. Now you'll notice that I was mentioning right-wing populism and about social and economic factors about why there might have been a rise of right-wing parties and strong men being elected in many parts of the world. And so some interesting research has been done on this. Here are some right-wing demagogues for you about why this would be. Why is it that we're in an age of anger? Now this is a really insightful piece, and this is very recently done. Sarah Engler and David Weistanner, they've looked at a fear of decline. Fear, remember, it's fear. We can talk about fear next week. It's about an imagine, but that's not to say it's fictitious, just in the imagination, something that's felt. A fear of social decline among the higher working classes and the lower middle classes, that over the last 10, 11 years, widening inequalities since the credit crash, austerity policies, seeing that the poorest have become much poorer and that their material conditions have become much more insecure, rise of food banks and so on. This has led, in their argument, to a fear that the same might happen for us. And therefore there's been a popularity for right-wing parties who are going to defend society, defend our borders, defend our institutions. Often in the populist argument, it's an us against them. It's us, the people, against the elite. But, and this is the point that the writer John Judas makes, it's not just us against the elite. Very often in right-wing populism, it's us against the elite who protect the immigrants, and the immigrants are the third term, the Uffa. These Uffas who are coming and overrunning our borders and who are going to collapse these boundaries and institutions that protect us. So fear of decline, fear of losing something we care about, which in this case is our own status. But that's not necessarily meant in a really vain way about our own reputation. Status here is about our security. It's about our loved ones. It's about our income. It's about our position. We don't want to lose something because we've seen many other people lose it. Now, I think this is a very interesting point. Let's move on a bit. Let's move on to this idea of transition. I'm going to give you some questions to think about on transition, and we're going to try and discuss these in the webinar if it works. I hope it works tomorrow, but then I'm also going to set up a discussion forum on this as well. So Nussbaum says we need to transition from payback to compassionate hope. Now, this is a wonderful quote. It's at the end of page 30 and goes over into 31. There's some great phrases here. I quote, "Anger's idea of retribution or payback is a brief dream or cloud, soon dispelled by saner thoughts of personal and social welfare." A dream, magical thinking, but it's dispelled by saner thoughts. Nussbaum implying here that there's something insane about wanting retribution. Undoing of the self, cutting off your foot. I continue with Nussbaum. So anger, if we understand it to involve internally a wish for retributive suffering, and maybe we don't accept that, quickly puts itself out of business, and that even the residual focus on punishing the offender is soon seen as part of a set of projects for improving both offenders and society. And the emotion that has this goal is not so easy to see as anger. So that's what we're getting with Angela. Anger is put out of business. The desire for retribution is put out of business. And she has these three different roads. You take the third road, the road of future welfare, of projects that improve things. This looks more like compassionate hope. So this for Nussbaum is the transition. It's the putting anger out of business. It's avoiding the road of payback or narcissistic focus on status. It's about future welfare. It's about future good. It's about, in a way, rebalancing and rectifying things. And there's something really wonderful about that. Nussbaum kind of says, and this point is slightly buried in a bit of a digression in the argument, that ultimately this transition is premised on the liberal view of equal human dignity. We've seen this phrase in other Nussbaum works, equal human dignity and moral worth. This is what the transition has at the forefront of its thinking. So what does this transition try and do? It's focused on social welfare, and it's constructive by its very nature. It's not reactive, it constructs. Nussbaum says that it focuses on social welfare from the start, saying something should be done about this. It commits itself to a search for strategies. So this is the transition, finding something positive that we can do. She gives this example about how parents react to a child's welfare, to a child's anger, that if a child is harmed or if a child harms them, that they don't want payback on the child. That would be a bit crazy. What they want to do instead is make the situation better so that their child doesn't lash out and so that the child doesn't get upset. Okay. So if you're still thinking, right, what does this mean? Transition and transition anger. Then there's a quote just that you can see right now from 37, that it's about how things should be improved. But then it also involves this commitment to doing things differently. That's the transition anger. All right, so we've been talking for a little while now, and I think we've got to a point where we've kind of built up the case of what Nussbaum is trying to do. So some questions that I want you to think about and that I want us to discuss are these. What does Nussbaum mean by transition and transition anger? I've just kind of gone through this, but I want you to see if you can put this in your own words. Okay, so there's that. But then, to what extent does transition and transition anger overcome these problems of anger that we've been talking about, of dissolution of the self, of harming oneself, of harming others, of smashing a vending machine, of right-wing populism and so on, of slighting and retribution? Does it overcome all those problems, and are you satisfied with the account? Let's move on now to the example that Martha Nussbaum gives of somebody who is a sterling example of using transition. I'm going to show you a really quite powerful image now in a moment of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. pointing a bullet hole in a window aimed at him. So Nussbaum gives Dr. King as an example of somebody who deals with the anger and pain of Black Americans in the Civil Rights era, but he takes that anger and quite quickly kind of channels it towards kind of more constructive ends that are about future welfare, not just of Black Americans, but of white Americans, of America entirely, framed in universal moral values of cooperation, love, and peace. Now, powerfully, this plays out in the civil disobedience, which is peaceful and passive, in the famous marches, in which the marchers were often very violently attacked by police. We can see this here. Now, when we look at this image, we probably see the cop. But if you look at the dogs, and then if you look at the young man, there's something quite distressing happening here. The dogs are about to bite him. Now, if we look at the young man's expression, he is afraid. But look at the way that his face is a kind of a rock of strength. He continues to walk even though the dogs attack him. Everyone looks around at him. He's a striking example of what Dr. King would call soul force, which is the way that he translates Gandhi's concept of satyagraha. Soul force of loving force, love force, peace. Somebody who embodies and lives out values of peace and cooperation, and presents this as a kind of moral weapon against the oppressor, that they do not use the oppressor's tools, that they fight back using a completely different vocabulary, because their goal isn't to fight back racist white America, but to change the world, to change the living conditions of Black Americans in the South. So Nussbaum gives this using, well, not this image, but of the example of the speech that probably many of us know, I Have a Dream. Now, this speech begins with the wrongful injury of racism. 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, things haven't really changed. In the words of Dr. King, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. Now, Nussbaum notes that he could then say, right, we should be angry about this. This calls for days of rage. We must fight back at white America or the police because of this. This is so unfair. This is so unjust. But instead, he moves to what Nussbaum is calling transition. The transition here is around this concept of moral debt. And so Dr. King uses this example of defaulting on a check. That America has given the Negro people a bad check, he says. A check which has come back marked insufficient funds. Now, this is about moral debt, that America owes something to all people, black or white. But it hasn't paid up this. Now, we might be thinking here too about this focus on the act rather than shame. So guilt, when we had this guilt and shame distinction, guilt is about a wrongful act, but shame is about a wrongful being, a wrongful person. Dr. King doesn't blame white America. They are not bad because of what they have done. Instead, they have failed to live up to a certain ideal that they already hold. And then this can be restored. This can be rebalanced. And that's a powerful quote. We must not be guilty of wrongful deeds. Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred. Again and again we must rise to the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force. Of course, famously with the marches. But this involves something very heroic. And for authors of the civil rights era, it involves something that could potentially be quite deluded. If we face such serious and real violence, lethal violence, how can we not fight back? We might try and pursue peaceful means, but what if the system is entirely rigged against us? This, of course, is the position of Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam. In a speech, Malcolm X makes a contrast between the ballot or the bullet. That if white America doesn't live up to some of the promises or claims that it's going to make about, creating racial equality, then out of necessity, black Americans are going to need to fight back violently because they cannot get anywhere with peaceful resistance. Now, some of you might be familiar with this debate, or others like it, that peaceful civil disobedience, marches and occupations, they don't work because they don't threaten the oppressor enough. They're easily kind of, put to one side. That they don't truly wrong injustices. Now, Nussbaum has kind of got something like this problem in mind when she says, we had this at the very beginning of this lecture, about the two things that anger can do. That sometimes anger can rebalance statuses. If you kind of inflict harm on someone that's wronged you, you might be able to improve your own status. But she says it's still going to be using something that's ultimately harmful. But maybe it's the fear of rioting or the fear of violence which pushes change. Or maybe not. That's something that we can discuss. In any case, both writers were in a society in which there was such obvious and blatant injustice and blatant racism. And the question is, how do you respond? Nussbaum seems to be suggesting that we need to focus on the transition. We need to be focused on something that is about future welfare. But she gives these examples that are very heroic. Dr. King is one, and he is a hero. But enough of this TV program, this cowboy who is, he's nearly killed because somebody takes his horse, I think, or something like this. And then he sees the guy later on in town and he's with his family, but he sees that the guy has got a young family and he decides that he's not going to harm this person. He's going to swallow his anger. Now, Nussbaum says that this is a good example. This makes him a truly heroic man, that he could have lashed out because he was nearly killed, but he doesn't. Same with Dr. King. Same with lots of other examples. But let's think just a little bit about the civil rights context. How satisfactory was that? On one level, we might say that peaceful resistance was very powerful, and it did lead to change, and it gave the civil rights movement a great deal of popularity and legitimacy among white Americans. But if we think about racial injustices ever since, we might say that it wasn't enough. I don't know. I'm not pushing a line on this, but I want to go back to this point about vulnerability and lack of control. That often there are situations where we kind of need to know that we can achieve a positive effect through social reform, that we can change things, that the media will listen, that politicians will listen, that there is some way that we can go about it. But I think in many cases we don't, or people don't often know, or they don't believe that that's possible. So when we think about riots, these are about people that feel failed and let down because they're not listened to, because an oppressive system harms them and treats them as second-class citizens. And they don't believe that the government will listen to them. They believe that the system is rigged against them. So I think we need to make space here in this account of anger for know-how, for a kind of constructive belief. Right, we're getting towards the end of this. I'm just going to present something else quite quickly, something that maybe came up earlier when we're thinking about the limitations of Nussbaum's account. These are from Charles Lebrun. These images of emotions. On the left is fright, and on the right is anger. that maybe in Nussbaum's cognitive account, her eudaimonistic account, we are not saying enough about how anger is physical and how you get anger in animals, and maybe it isn't about our circle of concern. Maybe it is always reactive, and therefore we don't need to just put it into these three sorts to pay back the narcissistic status or future welfare. Maybe it's just more basic. So these are two quotes from Thomas Dixon's really good review of this book by Nussbaum. He discusses the work of Charles Darwin and then William James in the late 19th century. And his point is that we can't just look at anger in this highly cognitive way. We're going to miss out maybe a lot of what anger really is for us. So Darwin, in his work looking at how animals and human beings express their emotions, says that most of our emotions are so closely connected with their expression that they hardly exist if the body remains passive. In the case of human beings, we may hate someone else or be really irate with somebody else until, well, a man might be, until his bodily frame is affected that he cannot be said to be enraged. That is something about the holding a face of anger. Like, I don't know, maybe you could try this now if no one's looking. You could try and in your face, maybe a bit like the way Charles LeBrun does, try and think about what an angry face looks like if you had to draw an angry face. What your eyes would look like. They might be maybe open wide. Your nostrils might be flared, and your teeth might be grinding together. And your face might be contorted. Your fists are clenched. Now, you're probably thinking, this is a crazy thing for me to ask you to do, but if you're humouring me here, try and hold this pose for a few seconds. Do you feel a bit angry? Have you got a kind of feeling of anger just by putting on the mask, the emotions? This is something that the philosopher William James says in What is an Emotion? Can one fancy the state of rage and picture no ebullition of it in the chest? No flushing of the face, no dilation of the nostrils, no clenching of the teeth, no impulse to vigorous action, but in their stead, limp muscles, calm breathing, and a placid face? The present writer, for one, certainly cannot. That is something about anger that needs all this physical stuff that Nussbaum is maybe leaving out. Okay, the other example that Nussbaum gives on injustice is about tax. I mentioned this earlier. Probably would have made sense to have brought it up earlier, but here it comes now. About P and Q. Nussbaum says that people are angry about the rich not paying enough tax. Now, one person, P, the transition person, the good person, focuses on social justice. Let's kind of create a positive campaign where we encourage everyone to pay tax around universal ideals. But Q's not impressed. And Q wants the rich to go to jail for this. Now, it's an interesting example. There's two things actually that come up here which relates to this. Firstly, I'm not really sure that let's say in these tax justice campaigns, or inequality campaigns like about the 1%, or people being angry that maybe Starbucks doesn't pay enough tax or whatever, Amazon or Facebook. Are these justice campaigns focused on retribution? I don't know if they always are. I think often the big party justice campaigns are not wanting to punish, say, Amazon or Starbucks. It's not like wanting to get the CEO and to stick them in the stocks and pelt fruit at them. It's more about trying to correct or rebalance an injustice. So I don't know if the retribution bit is so important. But notice something else that Nussbaum says about this example, which fits into this heroic stuff. Unfortunately, real political actors, including voters, are rarely as pure as P. So we've got this interesting thing that is coming up about the swallowing the anger is heroic. Michael Jordan focusing on the future, not getting eaten up by anger. The cowboy. Nussbaum is saying that this is the right thing to do. It is normative. And I don't know if you share that. Just quickly in passing. Nussbaum does present his three uses of anger. Her account isn't wholly against it, of course. We've got the whole stuff about transition, but also anger in itself can be useful. In the words of Law that we had before, it's a form of information. It's a signal that something's not right. It compels us to do something about it. Maybe also it deters people from harming us again. Okay. All right. the final part of this, and it's just a brief part, is about gender. About whether there's something about anger and the way it affects men and women, or in different ways. If anger is something that we associate with different genders in different times. So let me show you this. This is Jason and Medea. So Medea is seen as an example in ancient Greek tragedy of anger that is in some way inherently feminine. So I hope I'm going to do this story justice. I'll just kind of go through it quite quickly. My knowledge of Greek tragedy is not anywhere near as good as Nussbaum's. But in the story, in Medea, Jason and Medea are married. Their marriage is kind of insecure in some ways. They have children. But then Jason decides that, he doesn't want to be married to Medea anymore. And so he finds a new bride, and there's a kind of political thing. So he wants to establish an alliance with Corinth. And so he basically kind of dumps Medea, which is still like a taboo thing in Greek society, in order to establish his new marriage. And Medea is outraged and disgusted. So she kills. I hope somebody might need to correct me here in the comments. I think she kills her brother. And she ends up killing 2 of her children in order to harm Jason, in order to kind of say, well, it's the one way that she can take away something that he values and loves, is by killing. So there's this interesting thing that Nussbaum talks about, that at least in ancient Greece, anger was seen as something feminine and childish. And we saw that with the image of anger committing suicide. Anger era is something that's female. Now this changes, of course, in early modern Europe. Now when we think about anger in modern America, Nussbaum gives the example of babies and what's acceptable for babies. That when a baby, if a baby is labelled male and it's crying, this is typically interpreted as assertive anger, but in a female it's fear. Okay, you can just see that my battery's starting to run low, which means I better round up. But anger then gets feminized. Here in these cases, anger is about helplessness. Medea doesn't have that much control over her life. Now, anger is seen as something that is childish and weak, and therefore there needs to be something substituted for it. We need to Nussbaum's point is that we need to train people to see anger as something that's bad, and we need to get them to, when they experience anger and a bad temper, to focus instead on the future good, on welfare, of swallowing the anger and focusing instead on reciprocity. And she gives these 2 examples that maybe we can discuss in the online webinar. Adam Smith and a judicious spectator. We need to imagine someone else not affected by events commenting on this. And then we need to cultivate via Aristotle a sense of gentleness and sympathetic understanding. Okay, so the lasting questions for you that I want us to discuss. What is the account of transition anger? And are you satisfied? Is anger always something that could harm us, a contaminant? Or can anger be an energy too? Can it be something that we should channel without necessarily losing track of it? Is there something about these, process movements of today, of whose anger is a vital part of what makes them work? Maybe we shouldn't be transitioning. Maybe anger is key. Okay, right, so for next week, we're going to look at The Monarchy of Fear by Martha Nussbaum. So I've changed the content. We're originally going to look at something different. I want us to look at chapter 2. I'm going to make this reading available on Sunday evening. And then on Monday at 1 o'clock, I'm going to send you a link. We're going to try and discuss this through Microsoft Teams as an online webinar. But if that doesn't work, if you can't take part, I'm going to create a forum and a post. And if you just comment there, that's great. We'll have a discussion that way too. Right. Okay, everyone. Thanks very much, and hope you're all well, and speak to you tomorrow.